I mentioned phasing out coal. They're also agreeing to stop the support, the subsidy of coal mining around the world. Everybody here at this meeting agreed to, all the G7, I should say, agreed to net zero by 2050, plus nationally determined contributions by 2030. They all made significant steps forward towards the $100 billion we're going to need by COP to support the developing world in tackling climate change. Because we, as the rich nations of the earth, we need to build our credibility with those countries in asking them to make cuts in CO2, because this country, which started the Industrial Revolution, is responsible for a huge budget of carbon that's already in the atmosphere. We're now asking other countries to make a change. That's why this government put 11.6 billion into climate finance. And at this G7 summit, actually, you saw many other countries stepping up to the plate and making very big, and the EU making very big commitments. I'm not going to pretend that our work is done. So Mario Draghi, the Italian Prime Minister, who's the co-chair of COP, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, and we're going to be on everybody's case between now and the summer and on into the autumn to get those commitments and to make sure that we get the world into the right place for COP.
Well, earlier British environmentalist David Attenborough addressed the G7 leaders in a video message saying that tackling climate change was now as much a political challenge as it was a scientific one.
Our scientific collaboration on COVID treatment and vaccines showed just how much we can achieve together when the goal is clear and urgent. We know in detail what is happening to our planet, and we know many of the things we need to do during this decade. Tackling climate change is now as much a political and communications challenge as it is a scientific or technological one. We have the skills to address it in time. All we need is the global will to do so.
Meanwhile, G7 leaders endorsed US President Joe Biden's proposal for a global minimum tax of at least 15% on corporations.
G7 leaders endorsed a global minimum tax of 15%. Too many corporations have been engaged in what are essentially tax havens, deciding that they would pay considerably less in other environs around the world. But this is going to make sure there's a minimum tax, and I'm going to move on this at home as well. Minimum tax for corporations to pay for the profits they make anywhere in the world. And this agreement is going to help arrest the race to the bottom that's been going on among nations attracting corporate investment at the expense of priorities like protecting our workers and investing in infrastructure.
Our G7 summit comes to a close today, and amongst many other issues, President Cyril Ramaphosa reiterated calls to wealthier nations to support COVID-19 patent waivers. Now, for a wrap of the weekend's unfoldings, we are joined by economist Sifiso Skenjana. Sifiso, good evening. Thank you for joining us. I think just before we get into the nitty-gritties of what's just been announced by the president, in your view, how successful has the trip been for the president?
Good evening, Liesl, and to the listeners. I think a starting point for the president is really around lamenting on the challenges around vaccine nationalism. And truly, I think, telling the plight of the South African challenge and the African challenge around access to vaccines and how some of these countries, of course, are holding on to excess supply of some of these vaccines. And I think that's one of the things that he certainly, lamented around that as a success point. I think in addition to that, it sounds certainly that he's also made good ground in getting the thinking around what does the greening process look like for developing countries.
Yeah.
If developed countries themselves have a view around what the taxation model may look like for non-green investments, in essence, he's saying that we need to follow a textured approach and a nuanced approach for developing countries, particularly because, of course, countries like South Africa are still very heavily reliant on coal as an energy source.
Well, you've spoken about the coal source as a commodity in South Africa, and obviously the president alluding to the energy transition, which requires assistance at large. I just want to know from you, in terms of achieving long-term sustainable growth, what will this look like in a South African context?
I think even when we think about the energy complex in South Africa, we need to, I think, get it into a particular textured view around it. In that, one, alternative energy doesn't really contribute to the base load in South Africa, and therefore the thing that can contribute to base load is gas in South Africa. And so the transition component that's got to really speak to around how do we move our base load from coal to a more sustainable source is certainly not an answer that is centered around alternative energy, because of course we know that wind and solar are erratic in its nature, and of course we also haven't gotten there globally in terms of really getting the right kind of storage, electricity or energy storage technology that then can ensure that those actually can contribute to the base load. And so from a South African point of view, I think the transition process is really going to be answered by how do we tap into, for example, some of the assets we found on the Mossel Bay in terms of that gas being an enabler to increase the kind of base load that we've got. As we see it currently right now, we are still, even with the bid window 5, still buying and procuring electricity at a higher average cost than the cost of generation from a coal point of view at Eskom. And so we really need to ensure that the kind of technologies that we're investing in can drive the average cost at an alternative energy point of view, but as well as when you're thinking about a baseload context that then can generate certainly the kind of energy security that you need, we certainly need to think about gas as a core enabler, as a more renewable energy source going forward.
Sifiso, I just want to look at the future of geopolitics at hand. You've alluded to vaccine nationalism amongst some of the other issues discussed over the weekend. How is the landscape going to shift and change from here on to?
It's certainly going to be a very interesting one because, of course, we are in a world where now data in itself is a currency. And so a lot of the global economies are starting to look at one and say, how do they regulate some of the big tech companies like Google, Amazon, Facebook, etc. And because of the role in which information is becoming an enabler and becoming a strategic asset at a national level. And I think that's certainly one of the things that is going to be a massive shift in terms of how we look at geopolitics. And the implication there, of course, is certainly going to filter into our understanding of issues around the digital divide and what it will mean specifically in an African context where certainly access to quality and reliable data as an enabler for information access, for new innovations, etc., is really going to be a challenge. So I think, data is certainly the new oil in the way in which we see it in terms of the geopolitics. But I think also over and above that, again, it's really seeing that the oil in the way in which we knew it still hasn't left the global and geopolitical stage. And so we're going to certainly see that countries like Iran, Russia continuing to try and push the boundary around their relevance in a global context, particularly because of the resource endowment that they've got. And so in the context, then we bring it to Africa and say we still are a resource-rich continent. and a continent also that we're continuing to find interesting energy sources. I think energy is certainly going to continue being a very big theme in the geopolitical space. And so I think the two big shifts then in the geopolitics now is going to be around energy as well as around data as an asset. And I think that's going to be big contributors to what we imagine geopolitics to be going forward.
So let's conclude this conversation by looking at change that was on the horizon, especially amongst G7 members, the United States in particular. Are these G7 permanent members moving away more united after this summit?
I think it's both. It's more united and less united. I think we've moved away from the Trump era that I think was more overtly divisive, and I think now it's really divisive, not so much in the ethos, but in some of the implications around that. And so those who've got the right assets then have a bigger and a better card to play. And that can create, I think, a divisive and a wedge in the way in which these economies, I think, integrate. Again, we've seen that President Biden has come out and saying that they need certainly to review and re-energize the conversations around Iran and their nuclear base and their nuclear investment. And so I think on the one side, it is around saying that how do we create a more stable global economy? But on the other side, I think we found that particularly because of the fault lines that COVID exposed, it found that certainly some countries now have a bigger chip that they can play than others. And, we're seeing that as a global, for example, global shortage of microchips in the world. And what does that mean for a company like Apple? We're seeing companies acting and becoming like countries. And these are all the things that are certainly going to become more common features. Amazon, again, coming into South Africa, the big investment in terms of industrial space in South Africa. They see a big e-commerce play in South Africa. And so this idea around companies rather becoming like countries is certainly, I think, going to be a big theme going forward. And I think that's going to change the tone of geopolitics as well. And I think coming out of this summit, I think those are some of the big questions that we're going to ask and say, is that are presidents going to remain as relevant as they are, or are CEOs going to become more relevant than presidents? And I think that is certainly something we're going to need to look at with particular eye of interest.
Sifiso Skenjana, economist, again, thank you for your time chatting to us about some of the key takeaways from this year's G7 summit.